My father called my wedding a disgrace even before he decided not to come at all. My name is Courtney Blake and I am the daughter of a United States Senator who thought his public image was more important than being there when his oldest child said her vows on the day I got married. I already knew that neither he nor my mother would show up. I believed the hardest part would be looking at the two empty chairs and feeling the silence that would follow me home afterward, but I was wrong. Just minutes after the ceremony, while I was still wearing my gown, I opened the family group chat where they usually posted photos from charity events or political campaigns. My hands stayed steady but my heart felt heavy. I chose a single photo from the wedding and sent it without typing a single word, just the image, nothing more, proof that I had moved forward with my life without needing their approval. For 3 full minutes there was nothing, no replies, no reactions, no likes, no emojis. Then all at once my screen lit up like emergency lights. My mother called, my father called, my younger sister called, then people from the campaign numbers I recognized from political donor lists began to flood my phone with messages. Calls came in so quickly it felt like that one photo had set their world on fire. They were not shocked because I married a man who worked with his hands. They were panicking because of something else, something that appeared in the corner of the picture, something they had tried for years to erase from view. That single image carried more weight than I ever expected. If you have ever felt like a mistake in someone else's perfect life, you will understand what came next. I thought their absence from my wedding was the end of a long, painful story. I did not know it was just the beginning, the first chapter of a storm that had been building for years before I was even born, long before anything exploded in the open. The rules in my family were already locked in place. Our home in Washington, D.C. was less like a house and more like a set for a political drama. My father, Senator Malcolm Blake, treated the living room like a press conference and the dining table like a negotiation. My mother, Margaret Blake, was always behind the scenes making sure everything looked perfect. She managed the household like it was her job to make sure no one ever saw the cracks in the walls. I was their firstborn and they expected me to fall in line without question. Appearances came first, feelings were a distant second. Even when I was in high school I already knew the part one was meant to play. I was the serious one, the quiet one, the one who could sit through long dinners with wealthy donors without spilling anything or saying too much. I was their invisible success, the one they could trust to never mess things up. Meanwhile, my younger sister Alyssa was the one they showed to the world. She had a bright smile, an easy laugh, and a way of speaking that made strangers feel welcome. She knew how to pose for cameras, how to charm a room, how to say the right thing every time. Political staff adored her. They called her relatable, a word no one ever used for me. There were no shouting matches in our house, no slamming doors. My father never needed to yell. He could shut me down with just one sentence, sometimes just a glance. He would tell me with measured disappointment that I had let him down again, that my actions reflected badly on the family name. My mother never argued either. Instead, she would remind me how everything we had came from my father's career, that his image paid the bills, that the least I could do was stay quiet and make things easier. I learned to read his expressions the way other kids read road signs. A flicker in his eye meant I had said too much. A pause before a reply meant I should stop talking. A deep breath at the table meant I had embarrassed him somehow. It was training in how to disappear. One afternoon when I was around 15 years old, I went into the upstairs storage room looking for an old yearbook. The room had the scent of dust and lemon cleaner and was stacked with boxes from old campaigns and school projects. My mother kept everything for appearances. In the back of a cabinet I found a thin cardboard box filled with photographs. Most were familiar pictures of my parents shaking hands on stages or smiling at galas, but then I found one that stopped me. 2 young men leaning against a dusty truck, arms around each other, laughing in the sun. One of them was clearly my father, but younger, with a relaxed smile and longer hair. The other man looked so much like him that I thought it was the same person at first glance. They had the same strong jaw, the same sharp eyes, the same little dimple when they smiled, but there was something softer about the other man, like a version of my father that had never learned to turn his charm into a weapon. I flipped the photo over and saw a year written in faded ink along with one word I could not make out. My heart was beating faster without knowing why. I had never heard my father mention a brother. I had never seen my mother set an extra place at the table. I had never seen this man in any of our family photo collages. My mother's heels clicked in the hallway and I quickly slid the other pictures back into the box, but I kept that one as if it were a secret that needed protecting. I stepped back into the hallway with the photo still in my hand, feeling like I had just uncovered something I was never meant to see. That was the first moment I realized there were parts of our family story that had been cut out on purpose, like trimming someone out of a picture with a sharp blade. I kept that photo hidden in a notebook on my top shelf. As I grew older, a quiet reminder that what we were told at home was not the full truth. The gap between me and my parents did not come from one big fight. It came from the slow, steady realization that my value to them depended on how well I played along with their public story. College was treated like a political campaign. Career choices were judged not by passion but by how they would look on paper. My father never asked me what I wanted to do with my life, he only asked what would make sense for the Blake name. I found myself drawn to places that felt nothing like our house. I would visit community centers, aviation hangars, outdoor workshops, loud places where people argued and laughed and said what they really felt. I met people who lived without pretending, their lives were messy and honest, and something about that felt right. I never told my family about those moments. I had learned that the things which made me feel most alive had no place in the Blake home. I became good at wearing a calm face around them while building a separate world in secret. That was when I met Ezra Carter. He worked at a local hangar fixing small planes. I met him during a college internship. He was focused, quiet, skilled, but it was the way he listened that struck me. He didn't just wait for his turn to talk, he actually heard people. Ezra had no interest in showmanship or politics. He cared about doing the work and doing it right. He was calm where my family was tense, clear where they were vague, honest where they were strategic. I started spending more time at the hangar under the excuse of research, but what I really wanted was to breathe in a space where no one expected me to act like someone I wasn't. Our conversation started with small talk and slowly deepened. He would talk about engine repairs and I would listen, not because I understood all the details, but because his voice made me feel grounded in that space between engines and steel tools. I realized I trusted him more than anyone in my family. That trust made me protective of him and of what we were building quietly together. I thought I could keep those two worlds apart, my family world and my real world, but they were always going to crash into each other eventually. Ezra and I decided to get married. By then I knew my parents would not come. I chose a small lakeside chapel near Denver. It had old wooden pews and sunlight that poured in through tall dusty windows. It felt untouched by everything I had grown up with. I did not send my parents a wedding invitation. I simply informed them by email, like you would notify an office that you were taking a day off. Their reply came days later, a message from my mother that sounded like a business memo. She mentioned that my father's schedule was full, that my wedding date created complications, that politics required careful timing. She never said congratulations, never asked how I was, never mentioned Ezra. When the ceremony began, I looked at the two empty chairs in the front row and felt only a dull ache, like a bruise. I had gotten used to the guests in the chapel were not family by blood, but they were family by choice. Ezra's co-workers, people from the hangar, a few close friends. They came because they cared, because they wanted to be there. Among them was a man I had met just a few months earlier, Thomas Hale. I recognized him instantly because he looked just like the man in the photograph I had found all those years ago. He had the same jaw, the same eyes, the same quiet strength. I had never known his name until we crossed paths at a local community gathering. When he introduced himself and quietly mentioned his connection to my father, everything clicked. Thomas did not demand attention. He did not come looking to stir the past. He simply carried himself like someone who had once been pushed out of his own life. I did not ask him for the full story, not yet. I was not ready, but I knew the truth had started to knock at the door. I did not know that sending one simple photo would trigger an earthquake through my family's carefully controlled world. The reception after our wedding took place under a white canopy behind Ezra's workplace, a quiet open-air gathering filled with mismatched chairs, string lights, and laughter. I walked through the celebration in a daze, not from sadness, but from the surprising lightness. I felt there was no media, no photographers, no planned speeches, just Ezra's co-workers, a few classmates, and people who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I saw real joy there, not the rehearsed smiles I had grown up around. Ezra moved between groups, relaxed and grounded, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands always busy, helping, serving, laughing with the people around him. That ease reminded me of why I had chosen this life, because it was real. And then across the courtyard I saw Thomas Hale sitting at the edge of a table, quiet, watching the celebration unfold. He did not speak to many people, he did not try to make himself known, but something about his presence pulled my attention again and again. There was no bitterness in his face, just a calm, reflective energy. As I stood there beside Ezra, I realized something. The absence of my parents no longer hurt like it once did, but the presence of Thomas meant something deeper. It felt like a bridge between a truth I had always suspected and the one I had never dared to confirm. When one of Ezra's friends asked for a group picture, I stood beside my husband, and before I could fully think through it, Thomas stepped into the frame beside us. It was a simple moment, quick and natural, but the second the camera clicked, I felt it. A shift, a door had closed behind me and a new one opened. I sent that photo to the family group chat, not with malice, but as a statement, without explanation, without apology, just the truth. The three of us standing together, me, Ezra, and Thomas. The first did not expect the explosion that followed. The calls and messages came so fast they blurred into each other, first from my sister, then from my mother, then from numbers connected to the campaign team. I ignored every one of them. I did not offer a reply, not even a single word, because silence speaks louder than any defense in a house where appearances rule, and my silence rattled them deeper than shouting ever could. What I understood in that moment was this: my parents were not panicking because of who I married, they were panicking because Thomas was in that frame. Thomas Hail the face from the photo I found as a teenager. The ghost they had spent decades burying had suddenly returned to the surface, and this time he was visible to more than just me. A few days passed before anything happened on the surface. Then one morning, as I was organizing tool logs in the hangar, a sleek black sedan pulled into the gravel lot behind the building. I recognized the vehicle instantly. Government-issued tinted windows, polished surface. It was the kind of car my father used for press appearances. A moment later, Alyssa stepped out of it wearing designer denim and a blazer, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked like glass. Her face was composed, but her eyes told a different story. She walked across the gravel like the ground was beneath her and not around her, as if every stone was a challenge she refused to acknowledge. She did not come to see me because she missed me or wanted reconciliation. She came because something was falling apart and she did not know how to stop it. I led her to a quieter space behind the hangar, away from the sound of engines and metal. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips moved slowly as if she was calculating every word. I recognized that look. It was the same one she used to wear before public speaking events when we were children. A smile fixed over discomfort, a polished front wrapped around something. Trembling, she told me that the chaos I had set off went deeper than I realized. My father had been negotiating a major industrial partnership, and the photo had triggered questions, ones that were never meant to surface. Again, people in high places had started asking about Thomas, who he was, where he had been, what his connection was to the senator. Some had remembered vague whispers from years ago, a dispute, a falling out, a missing relative. The image I had sent did not confirm anything, but it reignited old stories, and now people were pulling at loose threads trying to find the missing piece. Alyssa's voice stayed low but sharp. She was not there on behalf of love or family. She was there to manage damage. She told me that my photo had become a problem not just for the campaign but for the family brand. She used those words without irony, the family brand, as if we were a company and I was a product malfunctioning. I let her talk. I listened without flinching. She spoke of networks unraveling, donors hesitating, political advisors growing uneasy, but what struck me most was that she was not asking for the truth. She was asking for silence. She wanted me to take the photo down, to speak to no one, to step back into line just long enough to steady the ground under her own ambitions. Her world was built on control, and now that world was shaking. I told her calmly that I would not be removing the photo. I told her I would not be issuing a statement or clarifying anything. I told her that for the first time I had chosen truth and I would not be walking that back. Alyssa's posture hardened, her shoulders rose, her eyes narrowed, but she did not fight me. She just nodded stiffly and walked back toward the sedan. She looked smaller as she moved away, like someone returning to a place they no longer believed in. I watched her car vanish down the gravel path, and I understood in that moment that the picture I had sent had done more than spark a scandal. It had uncovered something they had built their lives trying to hide, not because it was illegal or disgraceful, but because it was uncontrollable, because Thomas had once refused to play by their rules, and people who refuse to follow the script cannot be part of the production. In the days after Alyssa's visit, I went back to my routines at the hangar, but I could feel it all shifting, the whispers growing louder, the political pressure mounting. My phone buzzed constantly with calls I did not answer. My parents did not reach out directly, but I could sense them tightening the lines around me, trying to regain control. Ezra noticed the change too, but he never pressed. He stood with me, steady and calm, the eye of a storm. I had not known I was still inside. We did not speak about the chaos much. We did not have to. Every time I looked at him I remembered why I had left that world in the first place, why I had chosen this one instead, in a home where truth had always been dangerous. Ezra's honesty was a kind of peace I never wanted to lose. The calls kept coming, the noise kept growing, but I stayed still. I had spent my entire life learning how to walk without being noticed, how to breathe without drawing attention, and now, for the first time, I was being seen, not because I shouted, but because I had stopped hiding, because I had taken a picture and refused to apologize for the people in it, and that was more dangerous to my parents than any protest, more terrifying than any accusation, because it meant I had stopped asking for permission and started living without it. After Alyssa left and the car disappeared beyond the hangar gates, I stood there a while longer, breathing in the silence she had left behind. The air smelled like oil and metal and old wood, the kind of air that clung to skin and memory, the kind that reminded you where you were and where you were not. I looked around at the rows of metal tools, the open engine bay, the patched concrete floor, and I knew this was home, not the marble-tiled silence of my childhood house, but this space where things broke and were fixed again, where noise was normal and truth was not something you had to rehearse. I stayed focused on my work, trying to stay steady while the political world surrounding my parents began to shift like a fault line about to crack beneath a city. Ezra never asked questions about what was happening, but he watched me closely, his presence steady, his hands always busy and ready. I found comfort in that, in the way he didn't push for explanations, in the way he simply showed up over and over again, as though that was all that ever mattered. I knew things were escalating behind closed doors, even if no one said it directly, because the silence from my parents had gone from cold to strategic. I could feel the planning happening in the background, the damage control, the crisis meetings, the storyboarding of our family's next public act, but I also knew this time the script was slipping out of their hands. The following week I arrived at the hangar earlier than usual. The light was still soft on The pavement as I unlocked the back door and headed toward Ezra's office to grab a clipboard. I flipped open my phone to check messages, and there it was, a headline blinking from a political news alert. It was from one of the smaller but sharp-edged news platforms, the kind that did not need full proof to start a fire. The article mentioned an internal review linked to a stalled industrial partnership, one that my father had been deeply involved with. There were no direct accusations, no names, only phrases like lack of transparency and unconfirmed familial dispute and legacy concerns. I read the article twice, then a third time. It never mentioned my father or Thomas by name, but it did not have to. Anyone who followed Washington politics even loosely would understand the hints. The connections were clear to anyone willing to look too closely. I felt my heartbeat shift, not from fear but from understanding. The article was not an attack, it was an opening. It was the first sign that others had started to notice what my parents had tried for years to bury. The photograph had not started this, it had only exposed what had been buried under layers of public image and careful silence for decades. The real story had always been there, quietly waiting for someone to look long enough. I stepped outside and stood at the edge of the lot, breathing deeply. The cold air burned a little at the back of my throat, but it helped me feel present. I looked out across the stretch of asphalt and grass and thought about how many years I had believed my parents' version of the story, the one where family meant loyalty and loyalty meant silence, the one where being a Blake meant choosing the right college, the right career, the right partner, and above all else the right silence. But here, in this space where grease marked the walls and planes waited to be repaired, I had chosen something else. I had chosen Ezra, and that choice had opened a door to a truth they could not contain. I walked back inside and went through the motions of the day, helping Ezra, logging parts, calling vendors, but my mind stayed fixed on the shift that had started a few days later. More stories followed, one about donor withdrawal from a key campaign, a second about a sudden rescheduling of a Senate committee appearance. My father had always known how to spin chaos into opportunity, but this time it felt different, like the foundation beneath his name was cracking, not from one major blow but from thousands of small, precise questions. A rumor here, a question there, a photograph with no caption that refused to be ignored. I knew it was only a matter of time before they reached out again, and this time it would not be Alyssa delivering the message, it would be them. A few nights after the second article ran, I returned home late. The stars above Denver were clear and sharp, and the cold made my skin tighten. As I pulled my jacket closer, I reached the top of the stairs and noticed a cream envelope slid under my apartment door. My name was written in my mother's handwriting, perfect and even. As always, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a short message, only a few lines long. It asked me to come to the house for a necessary conversation. No apology, no warmth, just the assumption that I would come because that was what I had always done. I stared at the note for a long time, letting its simplicity speak for everything it lacked. I did not feel fear or anger, only clarity. This was not a gesture of reconciliation, it was a summons. They were trying to regain control, to pull the story back into their hands, but I was not the same person who had once waited for their approval like it was oxygen. I made the decision to go, not for them but for myself, because I needed to see it through. I needed to walk into that house one last time, not as the daughter who tried to fit into their picture, but as the woman who had stepped out of the frame. The next day I arrived in the late afternoon. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, clean, precise, silent, like a museum built for show, not for living. I stepped through the front door and the familiar scent of furniture polish and old secrets hit me immediately. My father was waiting near the dining room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. My mother stood behind him, her face composed, her hands folded like a politician's wife prepared to deliver a statement. They did not offer a greeting, they did not ask how I was or say they were glad I came. Instead, they began speaking about what had happened, the stories, the fallout, the questions from colleagues, the shift in tone from trusted allies. They spoke in terms of reputation, in terms of risk. They used words like optics and backlash and messaging. What they did not say was how it had felt to lose control over me, how it had felt to see Thomas again, how it had felt to watch the frame they had constructed for our family start to crumble. I listened in silence, letting them run through their practiced lines until finally my father paused and looked at me directly. He told me that my choices had accelerated a difficult moment for the Blake name, that I had disregarded the long-term consequences, that I had placed emotion above legacy. He did not ask me why I made the choices I did, he simply assumed they were mistakes. I looked around the room, the curated photographs, the spotless rugs, the space designed to look lived in but never feel it, and I felt no connection to any of it. I felt like a visitor in a place where I used to breathe with shallow lungs. I told them calmly that I had not made a mistake, that I had chosen my life with full intention, that I would not be removing the photo or issuing statements, that I would not be returning to this house again. My voice never wavered, not because I was angry but because I was free. The air between us tightened, but no one interrupted me. My father's expression hardened slightly. My mother's hands gripped each other tighter, but neither spoke. I think they both knew it was final, that they had lost the version of me they once controlled, and I was not coming back for it. As I walked out of the House the sky had turned a soft gold. The wind tugged at my jacket and I let it. I did not look back. I did not need to. The door closed behind me, not with a slam but with a kind of quiet finality that echoed louder than any argument ever could. I did not walk away from them out of spite. I walked away because peace requires distance sometimes, and I had finally learned that there was more strength in choosing your own story than in staying quiet inside someone else's. The days that followed were quiet in a way that only happens after something irreversible has been done, not the kind of silence that waits to be broken but the kind that settles over your skin and sinks deep into your chest. And I found myself moving through my days with a calm I had never known before. I woke up each morning beside Ezra and felt a kind of peace that did not require explanation or permission. I went to the hangar and worked, with my hands and my voice and my mind, without being watched, without being judged, without being compared. I stopped looking at the news alerts. I stopped checking my family group chat. I knew whatever storm my parents were trying to manage was still unfolding, but I also knew it was no longer mine to hold. I had handed it back to them piece by piece without apology, and the weight that once lived on my shoulders had returned to theirs where it had always belonged. I started noticing things more clearly, the way Ezra's eyes softened when he looked at me, the way my hands no longer shook when I spoke, the way the air around the hangar always smelled like hope and effort and freedom. I had lived for so long inside a world where everything was conditional, where love was offered only when it served a narrative, where loyalty was demanded but never given in return. And now that I had left that world, I could finally see how much it had cost me to stay in it for so long. I did not regret what I had done. I did not regret sending the photograph or refusing to take it back or walking out of that house without looking behind me. If anything, I regretted waiting so long to finally act like I mattered too. One afternoon, as I was finishing up inventory logs in the office, Ezra came in holding a package in his hands. It was small and wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address, my name written across it in block letters. We looked at each other for a moment before I opened it. Inside was a single photograph, the same one I had sent to the family group chat, but now printed on glossy paper and framed in simple oak. Behind the glass were the three of us, me, Ezra, and Thomas, standing together, smiling in that effortless, unposed way that said, "This is real and we are not hiding." I turned the frame over and saw a note taped to the back, just one sentence written in clean, familiar handwriting. It said, "Sometimes the truth shows up without asking, and that is when you know it was always meant to be." I recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Thomas. The first held the frame for a long time, feeling the warmth of it in my hands, not because it was heavy but because it carried something deeper than weight. It carried recognition, and that was something I had spent my whole life craving and never receiving from the people who were supposed to give it freely. I placed the frame on a shelf in the hangar office where it would be seen every day, not as a trophy, not as proof, but as a reminder that what we build ourselves matters more than what we are born into. A few days later, Ezra and I were invited to a local aviation event, a small gathering of mechanics, pilots, engineers, and enthusiasts who wanted to share their work and their stories. We almost did not go, thinking we needed more time to stay low, but something in me said it was time to step forward again, not to hide, not to retreat, not to shrink just because someone else was uncomfortable with my truth. We arrived just before sunset and the courtyard was already alive with laughter and engines and music. I walked through the crowd with Ezra at my side, our fingers lightly touching our shoulders, brushing, and everywhere we went people greeted us with warmth, with ease, with no need to pretend about anything at all. I spotted Thomas near one of the old prop planes, speaking quietly to a young boy who looked fascinated by the engine. He glanced up and met my eyes, and for a moment the noise around us faded, and I saw something there that I had never seen in my father's eyes. Not once, not even as a child. It was pride. Not in the way I looked, not in what I wore or how I spoke or who I married, but pride in who I had become. We walked over and talked for a while about planes, about the event, about how small spaces like this one could carry more meaning than the grandest stages in Washington. And then Thomas said something I would never forget. He said, "It is not that they did not love you, Courtney, it is that they only knew how to love what they could control, and when they lost that, they thought they lost you too, but you were never theirs to own, and you were never broken, just hidden. And now you are seen." I felt my throat tighten, but I did not cry. I simply nodded, because it was the first time someone from that bloodline had told me a truth instead of a version. I thanked him and he nodded back, and then I turned toward Ezra, who was laughing with an older couple about some engine issue, and I thought, this is what it means to belong, not to a name, not to a legacy, not to a brand, but to people who show up with open hands and open hearts. And I finally understood why my parents could never accept him. It was not about status or appearance or timing, it was about power. Ezra could not be molded or manipulated or used, and neither could I, not anymore. Later that night, after the event ended and we returned home, I stood barefoot in our small kitchen drinking tea while Ezra cleaned up the last of the dishes. I looked around at our mismatched chairs, our open windows, our worn rug, and I felt more at home than I had ever felt in any of the houses my parents had owned, because here everything was chosen, everything was Earned nothing was inherited or performed, it was just lived, and that was enough. As I got ready for bed, I checked my phone one last time. A single message waited from an unknown number. It said, "They are asking questions about Thomas again and your father cannot answer them the way he used to." I read it twice and put the phone down without replying because I knew this was not my battle to fight. This was the part of the story they had to reckon with on their own. They had erased someone they could not control, and now that person had returned, not with threats or accusations but with quiet truth and a kind of dignity they would never understand. I climbed into bed beside Ezra, who pulled me close and whispered, "We are good," and I smiled because we were, and nothing they did could touch that now, because I had built this life with both hands and both feet planted firmly on the ground, and I would never again ask for space in someone else's story when I could write my own. There is a strange kind of power in silence, not the forced kind that my parents demanded in our house growing up, not the kind that follows a threat or waits on approval, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are and standing in it without needing anyone else to say it is okay. In the weeks that followed the growing pressure around my father's public life, I lived in that kind of silence. I woke each day next to Ezra and felt like I could finally breathe fully, with no one watching, no one judging, no one trying to edit the shape of my existence. I poured my energy into the hangar, into the mess of metal and grease and problem solving that never cared what last name I carried or how I smiled for a camera. I fixed things that were broken, and in doing so I kept fixing myself too, without ever naming it as healing. I worked longer hours than usual, not because I was hiding but because it felt good to put my hands on something real and know that effort alone would make it better. The world beyond our walls kept spinning faster and faster. Reporters digging through archives, campaign members whispering about damage control, politicians who had once called my father a pillar of integrity now hesitating before speaking his name out loud. And still through it all I stayed grounded, not because I was untouched by the fallout but because I had already survived the worst part. The moment I realized my family loved control more than they ever loved truth. One morning as Ezra and I opened the hangar for the day, Thomas arrived unannounced. I had not seen him since the aviation event weeks earlier, but his presence felt like it belonged. The second he stepped through the door, he did not come in panic, he did not come with fire, he came with steady eyes and a quiet mouth and a small envelope in his hand. We sat down in the back office, the three of us, and for the first time since this all began, Thomas began to tell the full story. He told it not with bitterness, not with anger, but with the kind of tired grace that only people who have been silenced for too long know how to carry. He said that he and my father were not just brothers but once inseparable ones, boys who grew up thick as thieves, who shared everything until the moment ambition stepped between them. He said that when my father began his climb toward political life, the advisors around him told him that image was everything, that blood was not always thicker than headlines, and that certain people, even family, could be a liability if they did not fit the narrative. Thomas said he had disagreed with something in the early campaign years, something about money being funneled through a contact he did not trust, something about ethics and lines that should not be crossed. He had pushed back, refused to play along, and one day he was simply removed. No conversation, no fight, just a door that closed and never reopened. He said he had not spoken about it for decades, not because he could not, but because he had hoped for too long that my father would eventually make it right. When I asked why he had come back now, he looked at me and said, "Because you showed me it was not just my silence they demanded, it was everyone's, and because I saw you choose truth." And I realized maybe I was not the only one who remembered what it cost to lose it. Ezra reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, and in that moment I felt something unspoken pass between the three of us, something that was not reconciliation but something maybe more important, recognition. Thomas handed me the envelope and said, "I thought you should have this." I opened it and found a single-page letter dated more than 30 years ago in my father's handwriting. It was short, clipped, cold. It told Thomas that for the sake of future success it was best he step aside and stay quiet. It said there was no room for conflict in politics and that family would always be remembered but not always seen. I read it 3 times and then folded it slowly and placed it in my lap. I said nothing for a long time, and neither did Thomas, because there was nothing left to explain. I stood up and hugged him, and he held on longer than I expected, and when we let go I saw tears in his eyes, and I knew he had never wanted to be the reason anything fell apart. He had only wanted to be seen, and now he finally was. After Thomas left, Ezra and I sat in silence for a while, watching the light change across the floor of the hangar, and then Ezra said, "It was never about just you, was it?" And I shook my head because I understood now that what my parents had done to me they had done to others too. They had built their kingdom on silence, and any voice that threatened the calm, even for the right reasons, had to be cast out. The next day another article dropped, this one longer, more detailed, more damning. It referenced interviews with unnamed sources, it traced timelines, it pulled quotes from speeches, and it painted a picture of a politician who had chosen image over honesty again and again, and now could no longer outrun the past. The fallout came quickly. Sponsors pulled support, news anchors Questioned credibility. Former allies distanced themselves, and through it all my parents stayed quiet as if silence could still protect them. I knew what was coming next. I knew that when people lose control of a story they will do anything to pull it back, and I was right. 2 days later a message came from my mother asking for a meeting, not at the house, not at the campaign office, but at a private club near the city, a place they used for closed-door conversations, the kind where no cameras were allowed, no phones, no recordings, just words spoken into air that would never echo back. I almost said no, but something in me said it was time, not for them but for me, because there were still things I needed to say out loud with no fear and no filter. I arrived early, dressed simply, no makeup, no pretense. I sat at the table and waited, and when my mother entered she looked different, not aged, not tired, just hollow, like someone who had finally seen what pretending costs. She sat across from me, and for the first time in my life she did not begin with small talk or strategy. She simply said, "We thought we were protecting you," and I said, "You were protecting yourselves," and we both nodded because both were true in their own way. She asked if I understood what this had done to the family, and I said I do, and I asked if she understood what it had done to me, and she said nothing because she could not, because to understand it would be to admit it, and I did not think she was ready for that. She asked if I would ever come back, not to politics, not to the image, but to them, and I said I am not the one who left. That was done long before I ever sent a photograph. And she looked at me, then really looked, and said, "You are not the same girl we raised," and I smiled and said, "I am finally the woman I was meant to become, and that is not your failure, that is mine, and it is also my victory." We parted without agreement, without closure, but also without the need for either, because some endings do not need to be clean. They just need to be honest. The next morning I woke up before the sun and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the light creeping through the window, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that still hung in the air like unfinished sentences. I could hear Ezra moving quietly in the kitchen, making coffee, humming a song under his breath, and for a moment I let myself pause inside the softness of that sound, the quiet strength of a man who had never asked me to be smaller or softer or quieter than I truly was, who had held space for every part of my story without needing to rewrite it. I joined him and we drank our coffee in silence, but it was the kind of silence that feels like safety, like understanding, like a shared rhythm that does not need to be explained. When I arrived at the hangar later that morning there was an envelope waiting for me tucked under the office door. No name, no stamp, just a folded piece of white paper. I opened it and found a handwritten note from someone who only signed with the letter C. It said, "I do not know you, but I saw the photo and I want you to know that your courage woke something up in me that I thought I had buried. Thank you for choosing truth." I stood there with the note in my hand, heart pounding, not because of fear but because I suddenly realized how far the ripples had traveled, how many people had been watching and waiting and carrying their own hidden stories, unsure if they would ever be allowed to speak them out loud. I pinned the note to the corkboard beside our maintenance schedules, a quiet reminder that truth always finds its audience even when you do not intend to become a voice for anything other than your own life. Over the next few days people began to show up at the hangar, not in large crowds, not with cameras or microphones, just one at a time, two at a time. Mechanics from nearby shops, old friends of Ezra, neighbors who had driven past 100 times but never stopped before. They came with questions, with stories, with quiet nods of support, with nothing to gain and no script to follow, and I met them all with open hands and an open heart, not because I wanted attention but because I knew what it felt like to go too long without being seen, and now that I had stepped out of the frame I would never again help build walls around someone else's truth. One evening after the last plane had been wheeled into storage and the hangar doors were locked, Ezra and I sat on the steps again, our feet resting in the gravel, our shoulders touching. He looked over at me and said, "You know, this is never going to be something you can walk away from," and I said, "I know," and he asked, "Are you ready for that?" and I said, "I think I was born ready for that," and we sat there beneath the stars, the kind of stars you only see when you step far enough away from the noise of power and performance, and I knew in my bones that no matter what came next I would not flinch, I would not fold. I had already done the hardest thing anyone can do. I had chosen to live outside of the story someone else wrote for me, and I had not looked back. 2 days later Thomas returned to the hangar. He did not say much, just nodded in my direction and handed me a folder. It was filled with documents, news clippings, letters, old photographs, half of them I had never seen before. There were notes scribbled in margins, names I did not recognize, receipts from donations made in cash that never made it into any public record, and at the very bottom a letter written by Thomas to my father, dated 25 years ago. It was long, raw, emotional. It spoke of disappointment and betrayal and the pain of being erased from your own family. It ended with the words, "I hope one day someone in this family chooses honesty, even if it costs everything." I read that line over and over again because I knew I had become that someone, not because I was trying to be brave but because I had run out of room to keep carrying someone else's secrets. I thanked Thomas and he just said, "It is your story. Now do what you want with it," and then he left, and I sat there holding the folder in my lap for a long time, staring at The worn edge is the fading ink, the weight of everything I had inherited without ever being asked if I wanted it, and I realized in that moment that the truth is not a weapon, it is not a scandal, it is not a grenade you throw into a room hoping to see it burn. The truth is a mirror, and once you look into it you cannot go back to pretending it does not reflect you too. The next morning I wrote a statement, short, direct, without apology. I posted it online with the photo attached and a caption that said, "This is my family, this is my truth, and I will no longer pretend that silence is protection." I expected backlash, I expected anger, I expected to be called disloyal or dramatic or ungrateful, but what I received instead were messages from strangers, from old classmates, from people who had never spoken a word to me before, people who said they finally felt brave enough to say what they had always known to be true, that family is not about control or obedience or silence, it is about truth, about choosing each other even when it is inconvenient, even when it is messy and complicated and dangerous. I read every message slowly, letting the weight of their stories settle into my chest, and for the first time in my life I felt not alone, not invisible, not edited, just real. One message stayed with me more than the others. It said, "Thank you for reminding us that the truth does not need permission to exist, it only needs someone to stop stepping out of its way." I showed that one to Ezra, and he smiled and said, "They are right, and you are the reason someone else can finally breathe tonight." I held on to that line as the days passed and the noise continued. The news stories kept coming, some fair, some cruel. My father issued a statement that danced around the truth. My mother stopped appearing at public events. Alyssa unfollowed me on every platform, and I said nothing to any of them because there was nothing left to say, because I had already said it all, not in interviews, not in articles, but in the way I chose to keep living, in the way I showed up to work every day, in the way I loved Ezra openly, in the way I answered every hard question without turning away. The narrative had shifted, and it no longer belonged to the people who built it on silence, it belonged to the ones who dared to speak. It was strange how quickly the world changed once the silence was broken, not just mine but everyone else's too. In the weeks that followed my statement and the photograph being reposted by people I had never even met, the narrative around the Blake family began to shift, and it did not happen in an explosion. It unraveled slowly like a suit, losing its stitches thread by thread, one button at a time, and beneath that perfect tailoring the truth began to show itself, raw and unfiltered and utterly human. My father released a second statement, this one longer, more strategic, full of words like misrepresentation and political agenda, but it came too late. The questions had already spread too far, too deep, too fast. News outlets started digging into old records, not just campaign records but family connections, business ties, property purchases, donations under different names. They found enough inconsistencies to raise eyebrows, even if none of it was technically illegal. And that was the thing about politics. It was never about what could be proven, it was about what people believed, and what they now believed was that the man who built his name on integrity might have edited his own past to fit a cleaner version of the truth, and in doing so he had sacrificed not just a brother but a daughter who had finally stopped playing along. I did not watch the news, I did not read the blogs or the op-eds or the speculation pieces that ran late at night. Instead I focused on the things that made me feel real, the hands-on work, the laughter in the hangar, the small quiet life I had built that no longer needed defending, but still the world kept trying to drag me back into its noise. Reporters called, campaign strategists sent messages, lawyers hinted at negotiation if I would only clarify the timeline, retract certain pieces, soften the framing. I said no to all of it because there was nothing to retract and no timeline to revise. The truth was not something I needed to dilute to make it easier to swallow. I had lived every second of it, and I would not rewrite it now just because someone else was choking on it. Again and again they tried to make it about revenge or resentment or rebellion, but it was none of those things. It had never been about hurting anyone, it had always been about saving myself from the weight of pretending one more year, one more week, one more hour that their version of who I was should matter more than the truth of who I had become. I was standing in the hangar one afternoon, reorganizing a shelf of tools, when Thomas walked in with a folder under his arm. He looked tired but steady, the way people look when they know they have survived the worst of something and are now just dealing with the echoes. He handed me the folder and said, "You need to see this." Inside were copies of letters, legal documents, transcripts, emails. Some were decades old, some were more recent. All of them told a story that had been kept off the record, off the radar, hidden from public view, but now there it was in black and white, the story of how my father had pushed Thomas out of not just the campaign but the family, how he had rewritten public documents, erased names, shifted narratives, replaced fact with fiction, and left behind a trail of paper that only someone like Thomas would have had the patience to keep. Thomas said, "I do not want to go public with this, I never did, but I want you to have it so that if anyone ever tries to say you imagined it all, you can show them that it was real." I held the folder tightly and nodded, unable to speak for a long time, because this was more than proof, it was trust, and no one in my bloodline had ever trusted me with the truth before until now. I thanked him and said I would keep it safe, and he nodded once and left without another word, as if to say his part was done, and now it was mine. I brought the folder home and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, not because I wanted to weaponize it but because I needed to know that my reality was no longer something I could be gaslit out of. Ezra found me sitting on the edge of the bed later that night staring at the closed drawer, and he asked, "Are you okay?" And I said yes, because for the first time in my life I did not feel like I was carrying the weight alone. In the days that followed, the story faded from the headlines, the news cycle moved on, new scandals, new faces, new distractions, and slowly my parents began to reappear in public events, smaller ones, local fundraisers, carefully managed interviews, but the shine was different now, dulled by the questions that never got fully answered, by the story that no one could quite forget. My mother showed up in a photo at a charity gala, her smile a little tighter than usual. My father gave a speech at a university where the applause was shorter and more hesitant, and Alyssa posted a photo of herself on vacation with friends, pretending that the world had not tilted beneath her feet. But I stayed where I was, grounded in the life I had chosen, surrounded by people who did not care what last name I carried, only how I showed up each day, fully, honestly, and without needing to be anything other than myself. One evening, as Ezra and I sat on the porch watching the light fade across the field, I told him I do not think they will ever understand, and he said maybe they are not meant to, and I nodded because I knew he was right, and I finally accepted that not all stories need neat endings, some just need a point where you stop turning back. I looked at the stars above us, the same ones that had always been there, even when I could not see them, and I thought about the photo, the one that started it all, the one that tore open the silence and made room for something new. I thought about sending it that day from my wedding dress, standing in the glow of people who actually showed up, and I smiled because that girl had not just sent a picture, she had drawn a line, she had chosen a side, and that side was her own. And no matter what happened after that, no matter how loud or messy or public it became, no one could ever take that choice from her again, not even the people who taught her how to hide in the first place. It is easy to believe that once the noise fades, the storm is over, that once the headlines die down and the questions slow and the statements stop appearing, the fire has gone out. But I learned that truth is not like fire, it is like water, it keeps moving underneath, even when the surface looks calm, even when everyone pretends they have gone back to normal. It was a quiet morning at the hangar when the next shift came, not loud, not dramatic, just a shift in the way people looked at me, in the way they spoke, softer, more careful, more aware. I had become something more than just the senator's daughter or the woman who married the mechanic. I had become the proof that silence does not have to be permanent, that truth can survive being buried, that it can grow in the dark and still bloom in the open. I was standing near the open bay door organizing supplies when a woman I had never seen before walked in, her hair tied back, her clothes simple, her eyes carrying something I recognized from too many nights spent waiting for clarity. She introduced herself only as Meredith and said she had once worked with my father a long time ago in a role that was erased from campaign records when the press started digging into family ties. She said she had nothing to gain from coming forward, nothing to protect, nothing to prove, but she had seen the photograph and the statement and the way I had refused to back down, and something in her had shifted. She said she remembered Thomas, she remembered the early days, the tension, the way he disappeared without explanation, the way everyone was told not to mention him again. She said she thought he was gone for good, and when she saw his face again she cried in her kitchen without knowing why. She handed me a flash drive and said, "There are things on here that may help you not to fight but to understand," and then she turned and left without waiting for a thank you or an explanation. Ezra and I sat down that evening and opened the files slowly, one by one, and what we found was not explosive but undeniable: emails, meeting notes, memos, all circling the same truth, that my father had rewritten history not just to win elections but to preserve an illusion that had become more important than people he had once loved. It was not just about removing Thomas, it was about controlling the narrative so tightly that no one would ever question what had been left out. Ezra scrolled through the files quietly and then looked at me and said, "You were never crazy," and I laughed, not because it was funny but because I had needed someone to say that out loud for far too long, and now that someone had, and it felt like a kind of freedom I did not know I still needed. Over the next few days I carried the flash drive with me like a talisman, not because I planned to publish it or weaponize it, but because it was proof that truth once revealed does not go away, it lingers, it breathes, it waits for light. I thought about sending it to a reporter, to one of the outlets that had first picked up the story, but I chose not to because this was not about revenge, it never had been. It was about standing up in the open and refusing to sit back down just because the world got uncomfortable. I kept going to work, kept helping Ezra with repairs, kept showing up for the life I had built, and each day the hangar filled with more people who had questions and stories, and sometimes nothing but a quiet look that said, "I see you and thank you for speaking," and that was enough. One evening I received a call from a number I did not recognize, and for the first time in weeks I answered. It was Alyssa, her voice quiet, more tired than I had ever heard it. She said she did not know why she was calling, just that she could not sleep, and she kept seeing the photo, the one from the wedding, and she kept wondering how everything had changed so fast. And I told her it did not change fast, it changed slowly and then all at once, because that is how truth works. It builds beneath the surface until the weight becomes too much to hold, and then it breaks through and nothing can stop it, not strategy, not silence, not distance. She did not argue, she just said I do not know who I am without all of it, and I told her maybe now she gets to find out, and then she hung up and I sat there for a long time staring at the ceiling thinking about how strange it is that the people who taught us to lie are the ones most afraid of what we might say when we stop. She never called again and I did not expect her to. I knew our stories had split for good, and even if we shared blood we no longer shared belief, and that was enough to end it. I spent the next few days walking through my life with a clarity I had never known before. Every small moment felt like a choice of victory, a quiet reclaiming of space that had once been stolen from me, and I no longer felt the need to justify any of it. One afternoon as I was sweeping the hangar floor, Thomas showed up again. This time he looked different, not weighed down but lighter. He said, I heard about Meredith, and I said she came by, and he nodded and said, I think maybe we are all done hiding now. And I said I think so too, and he smiled and left me with a small package wrapped in old newspaper. When I opened it later that night I found a photograph, an older one, two young boys sitting on a rusted car hood, one of them clearly my father, the other clearly Thomas, grinning wide arms around each other like the world had not yet taught them how to become strangers, and on the back written in smudged ink was a single sentence, remember who we were before they told us who to be. I framed that photo and placed it next to the one from my wedding, and together they told the whole story, not the polished one, not the official one, but the one that mattered the most, the story of what gets lost when truth is treated like a threat, and what can be found when someone decides to stop playing along. The first time I walked into the hangar after framing the photo Thomas gave me, I felt something shift in my chest, something deep and quiet like a thread snapping loose from a knot that had been there for years. I placed the photo on the wall near the front door so that anyone who entered would see it. Two young boys sitting on the hood of a car, before politics, before pressure, before one of them learned to erase the other to protect an image that was never more valuable than the truth itself. People asked me about it, sometimes not with judgment, just curiosity, and when they did I told them that those boys were once family and that only one of them remembered what that was supposed to mean, and no one ever asked more than that, because you do not need full explanations when what you are telling is real. The photograph became part of the space, the same way the smell of oil and metal and heat lived in the air, the same way Ezra's laughter echoed off the rafters when he fixed something that should not have worked. The same way I had become part of this place, not as someone who arrived to hide, but as someone who had finally come home. In the following weeks life settled into a rhythm, not a perfect one, not quiet but steady, the kind of rhythm that tells you are no longer waiting for the next blow or the next command or the next quiet correction that steals your voice and calls it love. I stopped watching for signs from my parents, stopped wondering if they would ever show up in a way that mattered, because I knew now they had already chosen their path and I had chosen mine, and those two roads no longer ran side by side. Alyssa posted a statement on her social account, carefully worded, full of disclaimers about unity and understanding and the need for privacy during times of family hardship, and I read it once and then never looked at it again, because that statement was not for me, it was for her audience, for the people who still needed to believe that everything could be smoothed over with the right words, the right smile, the right staged photograph. But I knew better now. I had lived inside that script and I had burned it page by page until nothing was left but my voice and the sound it made when I finally started using it for myself. Ezra and I spent long evenings in the hangar working on side projects, repairing machines that had been forgotten, teaching interns how to handle old engines with respect, not speed. One of the young women who joined us that spring asked me one day how I stayed so calm after everything, and I told her the truth, because I have nothing left to prove to anyone, and when you stop trying to prove your worth you start to understand it for real. And she looked at me like I had handed her something she had been searching for, and maybe I had, because someone once handed it to me too, just by standing still and refusing to disappear. Thomas came by less frequently after that, but when he did, he stayed longer, not always to talk, sometimes just to sit and breathe the air of a place that did not require anything from him, not even explanations. We never went back to the past, never rehashed the details of what happened, but the silence between us was no longer empty, it was full of things understood and no longer needing to be said. One afternoon he brought a box of old tools and handed them to Ezra, said these belong to our grandfather and I think they should be used, not stored. Ezra nodded and said, then we will use them, right? And that was the end of that. No ceremony, just a quiet passing forward of something that once belonged to someone who had known how to build things before our family learned how to destroy them. With silence, my mother sent a letter around that time, handwritten as always, her penmanship still perfect. The letter was short. It said, I hope one day you will understand that we were trying to protect more than ourselves, and that sometimes what feels like control is just fear in disguise. It did not say I am sorry, and it did not say we were wrong, and I realized as I folded it and placed it in a drawer that she might never be able to say either of those things, and that was her burden, not mine. I no longer needed the apology to feel whole, because I had already given myself the one that mattered. I am sorry I waited so long to choose myself, and I forgive you for making me believe I had to. One afternoon Ezra found me sitting alone at the edge of the hangar where the sun hit the concrete just right, and he asked, what are you thinking about? And I said, nothing and everything. And he smiled because he understood, and then he said, "You know, this place feels different now," and I said, "I know," and he said, "It feels like it belongs to all the people who never got to tell their story," and I said, "Then we better keep making space for more of them," and we did. We started hosting workshops, small ones for young women and men who had been told their voices were too loud or too quiet or too messy. We taught them how to fix engines, how to find strength in their hands, how to take up space without apology, and every time one of them laughed or cursed or broke something and tried again, I felt that same thread pull tight in my chest, not like a knot but like a tether that reminded me I was exactly where I was meant to be. I received one final message from my father that summer. It came through a legal contact, not directly, and it asked if I would consider signing a statement clarifying that the photograph was never meant to imply wrongdoing, that the story had been misinterpreted by the media, that the truth was more complicated than it appeared. And I read that message slowly and then deleted it, because the truth is not complicated, it is just uncomfortable, and I will not dilute it to make someone else more comfortable with their choices. I never spoke to him again after that, and I do not think I ever will, not out of hate, not out of anger, but because some distances are not meant to be closed. They are meant to remind you of how far you have come and how hard it was to get there and how much you had to unlearn to even begin the journey. I closed the hangar late that night and stood outside looking up at the stars, thinking about how many years I spent trying to be part of something that would never love me back, and how much stronger I had become when I finally let go of needing that love at all. The wind picked up and I heard the rattle of tools in the distance, the hum of a world still moving, and I whispered thank you to no one and everyone, to Thomas, to Ezra, to the girl I used to be, to the silence that broke and the voice that rose in its place. And then I went home ready to begin again. I always thought the hardest part of letting go would be the silence that followed, the space that opened up after the break, the echo of everything I would no longer hear from them. But what I learned instead was that silence is only heavy when you are still hoping it will be filled. When you finally stop waiting, it becomes something else entirely, something that sets you free. I no longer expected messages from my mother. I no longer checked to see if my father had commented on news articles or reached out through someone else. I no longer looked for Alyssa's face in curated social posts, because I had already made peace with the fact that some stories do not end in reunion, some stories end in clarity, and that is more than enough. Ezra and I continued building our life at the hangar, slow and steady, the way real things grow. We started offering weekend classes for teens and young adults, teaching them how to work with engines, how to diagnose problems, how to fix things without fear of failing the first time. And every Saturday the place came alive with a kind of joy that had nothing to do with strategy or branding. It was loud, unfiltered and honest, and I stood in the middle of it knowing I was finally using my voice for something that mattered, something that lasted. I had never planned to become a teacher, I had never planned to become an example, but sometimes when you survive something long enough and choose truth again and again, people notice and they want to know how you did it and what it cost, and if they are allowed to do it too. One day after class, a girl named Jordan stayed behind. She was quiet, smart, maybe 17, and she had a look in her eyes that reminded me of who I used to be, too aware, too cautious, too rehearsed. She walked up to me slowly, holding a wrench in one hand, and said, "I saw your story and I just wanted to say thank you." And I said, "For what?" And she said, "For reminding me I do not have to disappear to be safe." And I felt my throat tighten, because that was it. That was the whole reason I kept going. That was the reason I had kept speaking even when it felt like no one was listening. I told her, "You never have to disappear for anyone," and she smiled like maybe she believed it, and that was enough for me. That night Ezra and I sat on the roof of the hangar watching the stars, drinking tea and talking about nothing in particular, the way people do when there is nothing left to prove. And I told him, "I keep thinking about how many people are still living inside someone else's version of who they are." And he said, "Yeah, but maybe now they know they can step out of it." And I said, "Maybe." And we sat there in the quiet for a long time, listening to the wind and the world still moving. The next day I received a letter in the mail, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was my father, short, cold, formal as always. It said that recent developments had caused strain on his political relationships, that misinformation had created chaos, that family should always remain private, and that he hoped I would one day understand the damage I had done, not just to the name but to the legacy. There was no mention of Thomas, no acknowledgement of anything specific, just blame wrapped in concern, dressed up as duty. I read the letter once, then placed it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a while, not because I was hurt but because I was done. I was done accepting guilt for other people's choices. I was done being asked to carry the weight of stories I did not write. I was done shrinking myself to fit inside a frame someone else built to protect their power. I picked up the letter and walked outside and burned it in a metal dish behind the hangar, watched it curl and turn to ash and disappear into the sky. And when Ezra asked what that was, I said, "Just the last lie I will ever accept from them." And he nodded and went back to work, because some moments do not need discussion, they just need fire. Thomas stopped by a few days later. He looked better, stronger, like someone who had put pieces of himself back together, not because someone told him to, but Because he finally chose to. We talked for a while about life, about the hangar, about a trip he was planning to take out west just to see the mountains and breathe new air. And when he stood to leave, he looked at me and said, "You broke the cycle." And I said, "I just told the truth." And he said, "Same thing." And then he was gone, and I stood there for a long time thinking about what it meant to break something, not out of anger but because it was never built right to begin with. A week later I was invited to speak at a small conference for young women in technical fields. Someone had read the article about the hangar, someone had seen the photograph, someone had followed the story and decided it was worth sharing. I almost said no, I almost told them I was not ready, but then I thought about Jordan and Thomas and the version of me who once stood in that upstairs storage room holding a picture of a boy who no longer existed in the narrative. And I said yes. The room was small, maybe 50 people, maybe less. But when I spoke they listened, and when I told them the truth, not the polished story, not the rehearsed one but the real one, I saw eyes widen and hands tighten and breaths being held because they recognized it, not my story but the feeling inside it, the feeling of being made smaller than you, or the feeling of being rewritten before you ever got a chance to write yourself. When I finished speaking no one clapped right away, and I liked that better because it meant they were sitting with it, not just reacting to it. And afterward a girl came up and said thank you, and I said thank you for listening, and she said I think I'm going to say something soon too, and I said say it loud and do not apologize for the echo because sometimes the echo is what wakes people up, and she smiled and I knew she would. The thing about telling the truth is that once you start you cannot go back to pretending. It does not matter, even when the world moves on, even when the headlines change, even when people stop asking questions, the truth does not disappear, it just waits quietly for someone else to be ready for it. And I had become the kind of person who would never again step around it just to make someone else feel safe. I went back to the hangar every day with the same steady rhythm, helping students work on old machines, taking calls from vendors, writing up lesson plans and fixing what could be fixed and leaving what could not for another day. And each time I touched a wrench or wiped grease off my hands or watched someone smile after fixing something they thought they had broken for good, I felt more whole than I ever had in the Blake household, where everything had to be hidden in order to look perfect. Ezra and I talked more about expanding the hangar into a bigger teaching space, maybe even building a scholarship program for kids who had no access to technical training. And I told him I wanted to name it after someone who never got the credit he deserved, and he looked at me and said Thomas, and I said yes, and we both smiled because it felt right, because sometimes honoring the past is not about repeating it, it is about rewriting its ending and giving someone else a better start. We called Thomas that evening and told him our idea, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I never thought my name would mean something again." And I said, "It always meant something, they just tried to make you forget." And he said thank you, and I could hear in his voice that something inside him had settled after too many years of being displaced. That night I sat at the kitchen table going through old notes, trying to sketch out a plan, and I thought about how far I had come from the girl who once stood in a storage room holding a photograph that shattered everything she thought she knew about her family. I thought about how many versions of myself had existed between then and now: the obedient daughter, the silent shadow, the rebel, the runaway, the woman who spoke out, and the woman who stayed and built something after the fire. I was not all of them anymore, but I had needed each of them to survive what I had lived through. I looked at the folder Meredith gave me, the one filled with records and timelines and decisions made without conscience, and I asked myself again if I should share it with the world. I had said no before, but now I was not so sure, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wondered how many others had been hurt in the same way, erased, pushed aside, rewritten to serve a story that only benefited the powerful. I called Thomas and asked what he would want, and he said, "I want the truth to live, even if I do not need to be the one who tells it." And I said, "Then let me hold it for you." And he said, "That is more than enough." And I hung up and cried for the boy in the photo who never got to grow into the man he should have been because someone else decided he did not belong. I spent the next few days writing a letter, not to the press, not to the public, but to every person who had ever sent me a message saying they were afraid to speak. Every person who had said your story gave me hope that I could survive too. I told them the truth is not a fire, it is a door, and you get to choose when to open it and what you carry through it and who walks beside you and what you leave behind. I told them not to rush the healing, that no one gets to demand your story before you are ready to tell it, that sometimes silence is safety and sometimes silence is survival, but when the moment comes to speak, do it for yourself, not for applause or approval or validation, but because the truth is a weight you no longer want to carry alone. I sent the letter out to a small mailing list, and within days it had spread farther than I expected, farther than I was prepared for. People shared it, reposted it, quoted it, and once again my phone filled with messages, some from strangers, some from people I used to know, some from women who had grown up in families just like mine, where love had rules and worth had conditions and silence was treated like maturity. And I read every message slowly with care because I knew what it cost to say those things out loud, and I would never take that trust for granted. One day an older woman came to the hangar holding the letter in her hand. She said she had printed it out because it made her feel brave, and I asked what she was going to do with that bravery, and she said, "I am going to visit my sister and tell her that what happened to us was real and I am going to say it without shame, and I hugged her and she hugged me back and we stood there for a long time without needing to explain a single thing. Thomas visited the hangar again a week later, this time with a photo album filled with pages I had never seen, family trips, birthdays, holidays, moments that were cut from the official Blake history, and when I asked where he had kept them all these years, he said I could not bear to throw them away even if no one wanted to see them, and I said, well, I want to, and we sat on the office floor flipping through memories that had been locked away, and I saw my father in those pages, younger, less guarded, maybe even happier, and I wondered how someone with that kind of light could choose to live in so much shadow, and I said, do you ever think he regrets it? And Thomas said, no, I think he convinced himself it was necessary, and that is the saddest part. One closed the album and said, then let us show the next generation it never has to be, and that became the mission behind everything we built, behind every lesson we taught, behind every photo we took, behind every story we invited into the hangar, not just to fix engines but to fix the belief that silence is strength and image is truth and control is love. We hosted our first open house the following month. People came from towns we had never heard of. Families walked through the hangar, kids touched the tools and asked questions, and parents listened to me talk about what it means to build something real with your hands, with your time, with your voice. Thomas stood at the back watching it all, arms crossed, eyes wet but proud, and when someone asked him if he was the Thomas from the story, he said yes, and that story is still being written and we are not done yet. There is something strange about peace when it finally finds you, not all at once but slowly, in pieces and silences, and in the way your breath settles into your chest without needing to brace for the next impact. I began to recognize that kind of peace in the way the hangar doors opened each morning with the same groan of metal, in the way Ezra moved with quiet rhythm from one project to the next, in the way people who once walked in with hesitation now walked in with belonging, as if the story they had heard about the place and the woman who ran it made them feel like they had a right to be seen too. I kept thinking back to that first day I sent the photo to the family group chat, how I had stood in my wedding dress with shaking hands and no expectations, just the need to declare that I was no longer living on borrowed approval. I had thought the fallout would be the end, but now I knew it had only been the beginning, because from that one act came 1,000 shifts, and those shifts had led to this life, this hangar, these students, this truth. And no matter how loud the world outside got, I no longer needed it to quiet down, to feel safe. One afternoon, while organizing old parts in the storage area, I found a small box wedged between shelves. Inside were receipts, handwritten notes, and an old tape recorder. I recognized the handwriting on the labels. It was my father's, dated from the early 2010s. I sat down on the floor, turned the recorder over in my hand, and debated whether or not to press play. Then I did, and the static cracked to life, followed by a voice I had not heard in months. Steady practice, confident. It was a recording of a meeting between my father and one of his early advisors, and as I listened I realized it was not just a strategy session. It was the moment Thomas's name was first officially removed from campaign materials. The advisor suggested it gently, delicately, saying the story was too complicated, the risks too high, and my father agreed without hesitation. He did not ask how Thomas would feel. He did not ask what truth they were walking away from. He simply said, then we will move forward without it. And I sat there in that storage room so many years later with the tape in my hand and the truth ringing in my ears, and I understood that it had never been personal to them. It had never been about betrayal or loss. It had only been about convenience, and that hurt more than any anger ever could, because when someone erases you for the sake of image, they are not just rejecting your presence, they are rewriting the value of your existence to suit their goals. I shared the tape with Thomas the next day. We sat in the office while it played, and I watched his face change, not with shock but with confirmation, the kind of pain that comes when the thing you always suspected finally shows up in a voice that once claimed to love you. He did not speak until the tape ended. Then he looked at me and said it was never about me, it was about what they were afraid I would remind them of, and I nodded and said, maybe we are all reminders that cannot be edited anymore. And he smiled, the kind of smile that held grief and freedom in equal measure. We kept the tape, but we never played it again, not because it did not matter but because it had done what it needed to do. It had made the invisible visible, and that was all it ever needed to be. The weeks passed and the hangar began to change in subtle ways. More students, more requests for workshops, more stories shared over greasy tools and late nights. I found myself surrounded by people who trusted me not because of my name but because of how I had carried it into the fire and back again. Unburned Ezra and I worked side by side every day, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, but always connected, always aware that this life we had was not the result of chance. It was the reward of choice, hard choice, painful choice, the kind that breaks before it builds and rebuilds stronger than anything you imagined. One morning we received a letter from a local education board asking if we would consider applying for an official certification program for young mechanics. Ezra read it twice, then looked at me and said, "Are we ready for this?" And I said, "We were born ready for this," and he laughed and said, "Then let's do it." And so we began filling out forms and writing proposals and gathering data, and in the middle of all of it I paused and realized we were no longer surviving, we were growing, and not just us but every person who walked through our doors and left with something heavier than knowledge, the belief that they were allowed to take up space and make noise and be more than what someone else expected of them. We launched the certification program 3 months later, and on the day of the first official class I stood in front of a group of young people from all walks of life, and I told them the truth, not the polished version but the whole version. I told them that I had once believed silence was safer than honesty, that I had once let someone else define my worth, and that when I finally chose to speak it cost me more than I thought I could bear, but it gave me more than I ever imagined. And I told them they were allowed to write their story, even if it meant walking away from the one they were born into, even if it meant breaking hearts and names and expectations. I told them they did not have to wait for someone to give them permission to be whole, and they listened. And when I finished speaking, no one clapped because they were still holding it, still processing, still letting it land, and that was perfect. Because applause fades but impact lingers, and I had not come for noise, I had come for change. After class, Thomas pulled me aside and said, "I used to think legacy was about names and statues and headlines, but now I think it is about what people do with the pieces you leave behind." And I said, "Then you built something far bigger than they ever allowed." And he smiled and said, "So did you." And we stood there watching as the students packed up and left for the day, their backs straight, their voices louder, their presence undeniable. And I knew then that no matter what came next, we had already won, because we had turned silence into shelter and truth into a foundation, and from that we had built something no one could tear down. The night before the official award ceremony, I sat alone in the hangar, the lights dim, the silence thick around me, the kind of quiet that holds memories like breath. I looked at the photographs on the wall, each one a moment, each one a face that passed through this space and left it brighter, and I thought about how far we had come from the wreckage of betrayal to this place of recognition. I had not expected this level of attention, but it had found us anyway, maybe because truth has a way of traveling faster than silence, or maybe because some stories demand to be seen no matter how hard others try to bury them. The university had reached out a month prior, inviting me to accept the Legacy of Innovation Award, an annual recognition for individuals who had transformed education through non-traditional pathways, and I had stared at the invitation for hours before replying, because part of me still flinched at the thought of being seen on their stage in their language, but another part of me knew that this was not about validation, it was about showing up and letting others know they could too. Ezra insisted we go as a team, so we prepared our speech together, keeping it honest, keeping it grounded. We did not want applause, we wanted clarity. On the night of the event, the auditorium was packed, the walls lined with people from all corners of the community, including students, alumni, donors, and yes, even faculty from the very same departments that had once turned their backs on people like us. I wore a simple black suit, no frills, no costume, just presence, and when I stepped onto the stage the applause was loud, but it was the silence after that meant more. The moment everyone leaned in waiting for what we had to say, I stood at the podium, took a breath, and began. I told them about the hangar, I told them about Thomas and the erasure, I told them about my parents and their choices and how those choices had shaped everything and how they no longer defined me. I told them about starting with nothing but grief and turning it into something that carried other people forward, and I told them that I was not here because I wanted their approval, but because I believed in accountability and education and the right to exist fully even when it makes others uncomfortable. I said, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay visible in spaces that tried to make you disappear. When I finished, the room was silent again, then came the standing ovation, but it was the tears in the eyes of the students in the front row that stayed with me afterward. I walked through the crowd shaking hands, hearing stories, people telling me how much it meant to see someone stand where I stood. I nodded, I listened, I thanked them, and then I found Ezra, who was standing near the exit, his eyes full of that same quiet fire that had carried us through everything. He said, "You did not just speak for yourself, you spoke for all of us." And I said I had to, and he said, "I know." And we left the building as the night air wrapped around us crisp and alive, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I was not just walking away from something, I was walking towards something bigger than I could name. In the weeks that followed, we saw an influx of applications to the program, some from students who had never even considered working with their hands until they heard the story, some from kids who had been told their whole lives that they were too loud, too broken, too different, and now they were building engines and welding frames and rewriting what intelligence looked like on their own terms. Thomas visited again during one of the new cohorts and stood quietly in the back as the students introduced themselves. Then one girl turned to him and said, "You are the reason I applied here." And he blinked surprised and asked why, and she said, "Because you remind me that I do not have to be who they want me to be." And he smiled, that slow, thoughtful smile that carried both pride and ache, and said, "Then I am honored." And I watched as he sat down among them, not above them, not apart, just their part of the story unfolding in real time. We Added new classes, new projects, new collaborations. The hangar became more than a learning space, it became a movement, a living, breathing refusal to be defined by limitation, and as we expanded we made sure to hold space for where it all began. We kept the original workbench, we kept the first set of tools, we even framed the old blueprint Ezra and I had drafted on scrap paper the night we decided to make something out of nothing, because those artifacts were not just history, they were proof that beginnings matter even when they look like endings. One morning I received a letter from my mother, short, formal, distant. It said, "Congratulations on the award." I saw it in the paper. "I hope you are well." I read it twice, then placed it in a drawer unopened after that, because I had nothing left to give to people who only reached out when the spotlight made them remember, and that act of not replying felt more powerful than any speech I could have written, because silence when chosen is not absence, it is a boundary, and I was done crossing my own lines to make others comfortable. The press asked for interviews. I declined most of them except one, a student-run journal that had followed our journey from the start. They asked questions no one else did, not about the betrayal or the politics, but about the process, about what it means to build something rooted in pain and grown with care. I told them that grief does not just vanish, it transforms, and sometimes the best thing you can do with it is give it a shape that serves others. We published the article in full with photos of the hangar, the team, the students, even the old machines covered in grease and pride, and it went viral not because it was scandalous but because it was honest, and people are hungry for stories that do not pretend to be anything else. In the middle of all this change I found myself waking up each day not with dread but with intention, and that was new, that was everything. I started journaling again, not for anyone else but for me. Small entries, quick thoughts, reminders of who I was becoming and who I refused to be again. I wrote about the students, the late nights, the laughter, the mistakes. I wrote about the way Ezra hummed under his breath when he was focused and how that sound had become my favorite kind of music. I wrote about Thomas and his slow, steady healing, and about how sometimes growth looks like a quiet man sitting in a noisy room choosing to stay. And I wrote about myself, about the version of me that had once begged for scraps of love, and how she was gone, replaced by a woman who no longer asked for space but built her own and invited others in with open hands and no apologies. And in writing all that I realized I had finally made peace, not with them but with me, and that was the most powerful revolution of all. There was something different in the way the wind moved through the hangar now, as if even the air had learned to respect the journey we had taken, the story that lived within the walls, the metal, the grease, the laughter, and the breaking points. The students kept coming in waves, each one carrying their own stories, their own battles, and each time they entered this space it was like they left a piece of their fear at the door and walked into something that felt more like belonging than any classroom ever had. We hosted open nights twice a year now for the community to visit, meet the students, see their projects, and each time those events grew bigger, louder, more alive. The local newspaper once called it the beating heart of practical education, and that made me laugh, but not because it was wrong, because it was too right. We had become something no one saw coming, especially not the people who had once told me to let go, to move on, to find peace elsewhere. But peace had never come from leaving it, had come from staying and fighting, and now it came from watching a shy 17-year-old who once flinched at every loud sound now lead a group of middle schoolers through an engine breakdown demonstration, or seeing a kid who had barely passed his math classes now calibrating a suspension system with the focus of a surgeon. We had built something real, and it was not just a program, it was a legacy. One day during a routine cleanup I found a sealed envelope tucked into the drawer of one of the old toolboxes. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting. I sat on the workbench staring at it for a long time before opening it. His words were short, careful, but honest. He wrote that he had seen what I built, and that while he did not understand everything about my choices, he respected the outcome. He wrote that he had once believed protecting his legacy meant keeping things quiet, but he now realized legacy comes from what you build, not what you bury. He said he was sorry for not showing up when it mattered, and that he hoped one day I would find space in my life for that apology to land. I folded the letter and put it back into the drawer. I did not need to reply. Some things were not about closure, they were about truth, and truth has its own weight, its own rhythm, and sometimes letting it sit is the only answer that makes sense. Thomas had taken up a part-time mentorship role by then, working with students who needed more time, more patience, more understanding. He was patient in a way only someone who had been shattered and rebuilt could be, and the students loved him not just because he knew what he was doing but because he saw them in ways they had never been seen before. And Ezra, he had become a kind of compass for the whole team, always steady, always pushing for clarity, for better systems, for stronger support. And for the first time in our lives we were not surviving, we were thriving together. I received an invitation from the same university that had once ignored my calls, asking me to consult on a new program design initiative focused on hands-on technical education. They wanted me to help build a bridge between academic theory and applied knowledge. I said yes, but only on one condition: that they come visit the hangar first, that they see with their own eyes what real transformation looks like. They came and they walked through the space, listening, watching, asking questions, and when they left they looked changed, not just impressed but awakened, as if for the first time they understood what they had been missing. We signed a partnership deal 6 weeks later, launching a pilot program that would send their engineering students to us for a semester of applied learning, and in return we would send some of our students into their research labs for exposure to advanced technologies. It was not charity, it was collaboration, and that distinction mattered because we were no longer asking to be seen, we were standing in full light demanding it. We added new bays to the hangar, expanded our tool inventory, set up digital integration systems to track builds and timelines, and through it all we kept the old systems, the grease boards, the handwritten logs, the pieces that reminded us where we started, because history is not something to erase, it is something to carry with intention. On the anniversary of our first build we held a celebration and everyone came, students past and present, community members, partners, even faculty from the university, and as I stood there watching people walk through the space, pointing, laughing, remembering, I realized something I had not thought about in years. I was happy, not just content, not just resolved, but truly deeply happy, because this was not just justice, it was joy, and it was earned, not given. After the crowd thinned out, I found a quiet spot near the back corner where it all started. The floor still bore the faint stain of that first spill, that first mistake that became the beginning of everything, and I sat there, knees pulled up, eyes closed, listening to the hum of machines, the distant laughter, the life in the air, and I thought about every version of me that had brought me here, the one who had cried in silence, the one who screamed into the void, the one who wanted to disappear, the one who fought back, and the one who stayed, and I thanked them all because none of this would exist without them. I took a photo of that corner, not for social media, not for memory, but as a reminder that small beginnings are still beginnings, and sometimes they are the most honest ones we ever get. Ezra joined me later, sitting beside me without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "You know, they used to say you were too angry, too emotional, too broken to lead, and now look." And I laughed and said, "I am still all those things, just with a key to the building." And he said, "Damn right." And we sat there until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in the kind of light that makes you believe anything is possible, even healing, even justice, even hope. The next morning I walked into the hangar before anyone else arrived. I turned on the lights, walked the perimeter, checked the logs, ran my hand across the surface of the main workbench, and felt the thrum of something living, something breathing, and I realized I was no longer holding on to the past, I was carrying it forward, transformed, and I whispered to myself, "This is mine, not in spite of everything, but because of everything." And then I smiled, picked up a wrench, and got back to work. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.